G'day chaps, 'tis I, Clampeder139. It took a lot of waiting for the mail system and cost me $600 to get a new console, but I've finally played the maybe long-awaited Gotham Knights. It's been through quite the ringer these past months, and I'm here to finally give my 2 cents on it. Was it the worst superhero game in ages like some to be claiming, or is it the next Arkham City like basically nobody is claiming? I don't know, I'm writing this intro before even finishing the game. So, let's quit stalling and get to my spoiler-free review of Gotham Knights. Now, I know this is gonna sound controversial, not taking an extreme position on this game, but this is the honest-to-God truth. Gotham Knights is the most good game I have ever played. Because it's just that. Good. There is not a single word I would use to describe this game other than just good. It's not so great it's the next Ocarina of Time, it's not so bad it's the next Ride to Hell, it's just good. The story is good. The combat is good. The cast and acting is good. There is very little I can give unending praise to, but there's also very little I can seriously criticize either. At worst, something might be meh, but at best, something might only be great. So the only way to really describe this game as a whole is good. Summary out of the way, let's get to everything meticulously broken down over this 14-page essay. Why did I write so much for this? I should have been working on school stuff. What is wrong with me? Even the pure-blooded detractors of this game have one thing they have to say positively. Gotham Knights is absolutely gorgeous. The neon aesthetic is amazing and lends itself to an absolutely gorgeous overworld. The graphics are absolutely stunning, and the lighting of the entire city was just beautiful throughout my whole playthrough. I absolutely love how everything stands out in the city with different colored neon lights. It's a great and different art direction I haven't really seen in a superhero game that gives it a more fun feel than the more serious Arkham games. And the overall set design throughout the sub-areas is just as impressive, especially in the Court of Owls sections. Say what you want about the story, gameplay, and everything else, you have to admit that the graphics are truly something to behold. And what kind of Batman-esque media would it be if I didn't praise the music? There are so many different genres coming together in Gotham Knights to the point that it doesn't really have its own style. It kind of just does its own thing throughout, and honestly, it all works. There's some intimidating orchestral pieces harkening back to the classic Arkham themes, but then there's the occasional garage punk rock almost reminding me of Sunset Overdrive, and occasionally even some upbeat techno music making me think of Watch Dogs. And they all mesh together surprisingly well, creating a very disjunct yet also succinct OST. None of the music feels out of place, everything has a reason to be there, both because of the playable characters and the enemy factions. The various pieces perfectly fit for the various scenarios you might find yourself in. Cold and intimidating music for when you're fighting for your life against the court, and more fun and upbeat music for stopping back alley muggings or bank robberies. It just works, and all the music itself is really good. I wouldn't call it memorable, since you won't hear me hum anything from this game at literally any time, but it's certainly great in the context of the game. One of the only stylistic choices I'm really mixed on is the voice cast. That's not to say they're bad, far from it in most cases. Most of them are great. I may have loved Troy Baker's version of Jason from Night, but Stephen O. Young gives a solid performance all around in this game.
I don't know what's worse. Having a chunk of my life taken away from me, or coming back to everyone thinking I'm gonna snap.
Sloan Morgan Siegel and Christopher Sean are pretty good as Tim and Dick.
Great. Oh, while we're at it, we should look at polymer volume and composition.
He told me never to take the mask up. Not like him.
Kari Walgren gives a really solid Harley Quinn, seeming to pull inspiration from Margot Robbie, but putting her own twist on it.
Well, well, if it isn't Brat Girl.
Michael Antonakos gives an interesting take on Bruce Wayne that I'd honestly like to see more of in the future. He's got a really solid and natural back growl.
This is a code black. This message was automatically triggered when I destroyed the cave and everything it contained.
And all the background characters like thugs, cops, and citizens have their own unique voices that are all portrayed pretty well. But then there's a few that are just kinda not that. Ra's al Ghul, for instance, though his appearance was small, had such a strange voice I just couldn't really get behind. In fairness, they're trying to follow up the absolute masterpiece of a voice that was D. Bradley Baker, so I understand the direction they took.
No one's coming to help you.
And same goes for Mr. Freeze. They can't really follow up the amazing work of Maurice LaMarche, so kinda just did their own thing.
A storm has risen over Gotham. Nothing can stop it.
And then there's Penguin, who I'm a bit more negative towards. I'm obviously incredibly biased towards Nolan North's portrayal, but there was also the amazing Colin Farrell in The Batman, both standing out for their unique voices and overall eccentricism. This one just sounds like a really angry businessman, not the incredibly eccentric Penguin that we all know and love.
But no one talks about them. Not a whispered word is said.
And then there's America Young's Batgirl. The voice isn't bad, it fits pretty well, but it really feels like she's phoning in 90% of her scenes.
I had access to every computer system in Gotham. How could I miss something as big as the court?
Maybe I'm just tone deaf, but it really doesn't sound like she's acting most of the time. It just feels like she's reading a script as a first pass and everyone was just fine with it.
We'd need an entire wiki just to keep up.
Even the parts where she's clearly supposed to be showing emotion are just kinda ruined by a really bad delivery. There are a few moments where she shines through, but they are very few and far between, especially compared to her fellow knights.
How can I be Batgirl? Solve crime, fight bad guys. If I can't trust my own brain.
Again, some of these are no doubt my biases towards other portrayals, but some of the cast just really felt off. However, to end on a more positive note for aesthetics, all you costume fanatics will certainly get your fill with this game, as there are dozens of unique outfits for each character that you unlock as the game progresses. Not only do they actually change your stats, giving you boosts to attack, defense, and health, essentially forcing you to change clothes every few missions, but you can customize them even further to really make them your own. You can change the mask, gauntlets, emblem, boots, and even the color of your suit for each character on top of the various styles the game gives you. So while you costume crazies definitely have something to look forward to in this game, even if it's something I don't really care about. The aspect I was most looking forward to in Gotham Knights turned out to be the most average part of the game. I was expecting big things in the story department for this game. The trailers had made it look like the court was this large, looming threat across the whole game, and that in between all their threats to the heroes, we get some really interesting personal moments with our titular knights. And I mean, we kinda got that. There's pieces of those sprinkled throughout the game, but they're never brought to the forefront like we all wanted. I mean, the court definitely provides the best parts of the game, even if their story wasn't handled the best. No spoilers, obviously, but there are a lot of quote-unquote twists throughout the game, and none of them are all that unexpected or satisfying. They kinda just happen, and I was like, oh, okay, I guess we're doing this now. Alright. Now, the more personal stuff I was really expecting out of this game is there, but it's nowhere near as present as the trailers had made it out to be. The final cinematic trailer for this game was an absolute masterpiece, and what I really thought the game was going to be about. It shows the Bat family's various insecurities and what they need to overcome to become the new heroes after Batman's death. But the game just doesn't explore that. The gang is just instantly ready to go out there and fight bad guys without a hint of struggle throughout most of their journey. In light of that, we get flashbacks that you can find as you progress through the story that show them overcoming these issues before the game even takes place. Everything that this trailer built up aren't even issues our characters have to overcome during the events of the game. We just see them work them out in quick little cutscenes of events that already happened. I admit, these cutscenes are some of the best story that we get. They're generally pretty subtle in their storytelling compared to the more in-your-face style the rest of the game has. They do show the Knights overcoming their greatest problems that they couldn't face with Batman. Robin being considered nothing more than a sidekick who could never live up to Batman's legacy on his own.
Then what am I supposed to do?
Try grieving.
Nightwing having to prove that he can be a leader and accepting that he isn't going to be a disappointment to Bruce.
I got this, Bruce.
Batgirl having to come to terms with the fact that she's not perfect even after all these years of training, and should learn to just accept the help of others when it comes her way.
I'm sorry. I'd like to do this myself.
Sure. Let me know if you need anything.
And most noteworthy, Jason having to accept himself that he's not a monster despite his past. He can move past it and be better, and that he's a part of this family.
Some days I barely feel human. Let alone a better man.
He believed in you, and was proud of how far you'd come. Especially after everything you've been through.
These are the most interesting scenes of the game, so it's a shame they're relegated to a very missable side mission. The only way you'd know these even existed is if you were actively looking for them every time you returned to the Belfry or had their mission marker set. I didn't even know they existed at first. I just so happened to run into one of the cutscenes when I was trying to do something else in the Belfry. They're that out of the way. And then the stuff we were all excited for, the Court of Owls, is just kinda okay. There's enough here to keep me invested in the story, and there are a lot of great set pieces with them involved, but I can't help but feel they were severely underused. And that's despite the fact that they're the main source of conflict throughout the entire game. If you want a cool Court of Owls storyline, you'll at least get bits and pieces of it in this game. But honestly, you'd be better off just watching Gotham. And the same is unfortunately true of the side quests. They're fun little distractions from the main story that provide some great set pieces and fun moments, but aren't very heavy on the story. They just kinda happen, you take down the villain and move on. There's no emotional connection for any of them despite having some of the most interesting villains behind them. In fact, I'd say Freeze in particular is pretty much at his worst interpretation since his inception in the 50s. Harley is pretty good, but that's honestly nothing new nowadays. She's always amazing. And unfortunately, I never got around to Clayface because his mission just never appeared to me, so sadly I can't speak to its worth, but I'd assume it's probably about the same. Just cool set pieces with not much in the story department. However, one story aspect I'm sure many of you will be happy to hear is that the trailers did not lie to us. Bruce Wayne is really dead. And he stays that way throughout the whole game. There's no quest to revive him or a secret reveal that he was behind the court the whole time and only faked his death to get the crew off his trail. He's really dead, and the game is genuinely about the Bat family trying to cope with this new reality where they don't have their leader. It was, again, one of the more interesting aspects that was sadly thrown to the wayside with the personal stories, but at least they were consistent with what they promised us. And especially surprising to me is the fact that this same logic also applies to Joker. Of all characters to even just make a small cameo, Joker is literally nowhere to be seen throughout the entire game. So all you Knight and Origins detractors who despise Joker in those games have something to celebrate, I guess. Hell, they didn't even name drop him once, despite Harley playing a large part in the game. They clearly understood that the general population has been undergoing Joker fatigue in the last few years and decided against the clown's inclusion. Respect, WB. Overall, story stuff is really give and take. It's enough to keep you engaged and interested to keep playing, but it's not enough to probably ever warrant me making a one amazing scene on this game. It's honestly some of the most generic superhero storyline in recent memory. It's fun, but not interesting. Like I said, for just about everything this game offers in the story department, you could do a lot better by just watching Gotham. That show covered most of the storylines in this game and did them a lot better, at least in my opinion. Gotham Knights takes a very unique approach to its campaign. As bizarre as it will sound to say, I can actually compare it to Breath of the Wild. Because after the tutorial, you're kinda just left to do whatever. You're thrown into the city and just told to stop crime, and that's basically it. You can go to the story markers and proceed with investigations, or you can spend literal hours just going into back alleys and beating up criminals. You're literally just thrown into this world and told, okay, go do whatever now. There's obviously a main objective, but you can get to it literally whenever you want. By the time I actually reached the Court of Owls stuff in the main campaign, I was already 3 to 4 levels above the suggested because I had done so much side stuff. I stopped a lot of crimes to get the heroes up to knighthood, and followed a lot of side quests because they were pretty engaging. Plus, every mission has a pretty severe difficulty spike between each other, so going out and stopping crime is basically you becoming stronger in-universe as well as getting better at the game. Because of this lack of direction and severe difficulty spike after basically every mission, some may consider this game a grind. But here's my counter to that. Grinding isn't grinding when it's fun. And honestly, grinding in Gotham Knights is fun. Probably pretty controversial to say, but I really enjoyed the combat of Gotham Knights. It's pretty much completely different from Arkham, but it honestly works for me. Most of the time. All the knights have 2 attack types, basic and ranged. Basic are your standard punches, kicks, and melee weapons, while ranged are, obviously, projectiles. You can swap between them pretty much on a whim to attack anyone against you from any range. You can also choose to charge either attack for a much stronger hit with a bit of a longer windup. There's a decent amount of depth behind the regular and strong moves, as they aren't just stronger hits, but different attacks altogether. So, figuring out which ones work best for this situation is an interesting challenge. On top of that is the unique critical hits mechanic. If you time your button presses correctly, aka just before an attack lands, you'll deal additional damage on your strikes. While in practice, it's more like spamming the attack button hoping you happen to land on the correct window, in theory it's a really interesting system because it shows you've learned what all the attacks are and can react to them with another button press at the perfect time and get rewarded for it. Ultimately, this game is less about thinking and choosing to do something risky for a big reward, and more about reaction times. You can dodge at literally any time you want, even in the middle of an attack, something Batman definitely can't say. So instead of planning out your attacks against specific enemy types, you have to be ready to react to their attacks with a dodge. And it honestly works for me, especially when it comes to perfect dodges, which give you a powerful follow-up attack if you can successfully dodge a hit at the very last moment. It really tests your patience and reaction times to be able to pull them off. Unfortunately, I'm pretty mixed on the momentum implementation. I see what they were going for, having really powerful attacks ready whenever you achieve a combo, but the problem is that some of them are so incredibly busted, while others are just not that. Batgirl's beatdown, for instance, absolutely shreds bosses and mini-bosses to pieces, while all her other attacks are really slow or don't do nearly as much to be considered useful. Robin's Staff Twirl also shreds enemies' health bars, but can also do it to multiple enemies at once, and apply status effects like no other attack in the game. Meanwhile, his clone dodge is just that, a dodge. It would be cool if you got it more often and you could use it with just a regular dodge move, but since it's tied to momentum, I barely found myself using it. Red Hood's assault shot is absolutely busted since it once again shreds every health bar in its sight, and also tracks onto multiple enemies if one is defeated while using it. It even reloads the handgun so you can go right back to shooting. Meanwhile, his Iron Fist move just give him a slightly stronger melee attack for a short amount of time, and his takedown is just a single takedown that'll reload your guns. And then Nightwing really got the short end of the stick, because his momentum moves are barely even usable. One of them takes forever to set up and is clearly intended for co-op play, while the others are just single high damage moves that literally everyone else already has tied to a full takedown, and a quick shockwave that only goes in one direction and doesn't even do that much damage on higher leveled enemies. Now maybe it's because I didn't unlock all of the abilities and some of them are actually equally as useful or useless for the other characters, but I really didn't have time to do that when I was already stupidly overleveled for most missions. It was a fun idea, but one I didn't end up using to its fullest potential. If they unlocked more frequently or even just had their own unlock tree, I'd probably use them a lot more. And speaking of missed potential, another area that they sorely missed out on was the grabbing feature. Grabbing is inherently cool, as it gives you free takedown on whoever you grappled or lets you throw them into enemies or other hazards. Unfortunately, you'll barely ever use grabbing because it's so rare to even be able to do. You can only grab an enemy when they're at low HP or if they're completely unaware of your presence, meaning you can only take them down or throw them when they're at low HP or unaware. You know what else you can do when they're unaware? A silent takedown, which keeps the other enemies unaware of your presence too. And you know what else you can do when they're low HP? Literally just attack them. It's so rarely used because you have so many better options in almost every scenario you're able to grab them. The only time I did grab enemies was when throwing or taking them down was required for a bonus challenge, or they were the last enemy that I could interrogate for bonus XP. I feel like if they changed the takedowns to just a beatdown in close quarters to rack up some good damage on enemies at any health, or throw them at any health, this idea could have been used a lot more. And in fact, they kinda did, and showed that it could work. Red Hood is the only character that gets grabbing upgrades, being able to grab enemies at half health instead of a quarter, and also being allowed to grapple brutes. This adds even more depth to his already pretty deep character, more on that later, and allows for full use of the grabbing mechanic in a lot more scenarios. And I have to say, it is pretty fun throwing enemies into each other or into hazards to instantly take multiple of them down. It's just a shame we couldn't use it more often. So with all this combat stuff out of the way, I can finally come back to the main point of this section, that being the grind. Like I said, it's not a grind if it's fun, and I think the combat of Gotham Knights is pretty fun. So going out and grinding XP for basically hours on end is, yeah, pretty fun in Gotham Knights. Every night you exit the Belfry to begin a patrol of Gotham, and you're basically just told to do whatever. You can stop predetermined crimes, do some side content, or engage with the main story. And it only ends when you return to the Belfry to conclude your patrol. Or more likely when you run out of healing packs and need to get back to the base before you collapse and die. You pretty much control how the patrol goes and how much XP you earn with each outing. You can completely ignore crimes or make them your main focus. And honestly, the crimes themselves are pretty fun, with a lot of variety in setup, gameplay, and faction. While the overall core will always be the same, just beating up some enemies, it's the enemies they throw at you and how they do it that makes these sections unique and fun. You might be stopping a small group from breaking their buddies out of a prisoner transport, or stop multiple waves from hacking terabytes of data away from the GCPD. There's a lot of variety to the simple thug beatdowns, which I really like. I also, slightly tangentially, quite enjoy the factions they chose for this game, because they're all pretty unique. The Freaks are inherently just Joker goons, but they have their own little spin with the addition of Molotovs and Brutes with shields and flails. The Regulators are really fun because they all have scrambled voices making all the guys sound like the Arkham Knight, and ice guns from Mr. Freeze, as well as shock-based Brutes, which are all really fun. The mob is the most boring, being just basic enemies without much of a gimmick aside from a large variety of guns, but also having the absolute hardest brute enemy to deal with a freaking sword and a crap ton of health and difficult to dodge attacks. The Court is great because they're also mostly basic enemies, but they also have the freaking Talons, one of the scariest enemies in the game, especially since they and their brutes can inflict poison damage. There's a surprising amount of depth to these seemingly cut-and-paste factions, and it makes every encounter unique, since you never really know who you're gonna face. And as another side note, I really like how we've become equal rights, equal fights combatants. Nobody is safe from our brutal beatdowns. We'll take on men and women alike, and it adds some decent variety to both the voices and appearances of the enemies. Now, side tangent over, that does bring up an interesting point. The game has a really slow build-up, which I am not a fan of. You start out incredibly underpowered and have to build yourself up with upgrades and crafting new gear in order to face the ridiculously powerful goons the game throws at you the more you progress. Your movesets also start out incredibly barren and only get better if you spend time upgrading them. Now, I traditionally hate this kind of game. If you tell me a game really gets good after the first 10 hours of play, why the hell would I play it for 10 hours to begin with? If a game isn't good right from the start, what is the point of even playing it? That's not to say Gotham Knights has a bad start, but it's definitely a slow start, which I was really not a fan of. Expanding your moveset over time is great if you have a good enough moveset to support starting out really barren. Again, look only at Batman. Batman has a perfect moveset to start with, and only gets better with upgrades. The Gotham Knights have passable movesets that actually become really unique and fun the more you upgrade. But until that point comes to pass, aside from Red Hood, they all feel really samey. Not really a fan, but it was something I was at least willing to trudge through for the sake of the game. I think it was overall worth it, but it may not be for some of you, so tread lightly. Moving through this beautiful world is a mixed bag. Regular traversal is decently fun with all the knights, especially when you get their knighthood upgrades and can get you around with that much more style. Unfortunately, your traversal methods before that point are severely limited. Moving around with just the grapple is fun enough, if not a little slow, and in a weird way kinda reminds me of Spider-Man. And when you get their knighthood abilities, it adds a new layer of depth to their movement, making it both faster and more enjoyable as a whole. Unfortunately, the supposed main method of transport before this point is one of the worst vehicles I have ever seen in a game. The Batcycle is just awful. No beating around the bush here. It's slow as balls, handles like a lubed up stick of butter, and is so incredibly boring that I'd rather sit through a loading screen than travel with it. Give me the Tankmobile any day of the week over this terrible excuse for a motorcycle. And it's not like it even has any applications other than travel. Vehicle chases are incredibly rare and incredibly boring on top of that. Those are literally the only time you use the cycle for something other than travel, and they aren't even part of the main campaign. In fact, you could go the entire game without ever using the Bat Cycle. That's how utterly inconsequential it is to this game. Which is especially disappointing when you're literally given fast travel points at the 1/3 mark of the game, making its inclusion even more pointless. At least the Batmobile was fun to drive, even if it was technically slower than fully boosted gliding. The Batcycle is not only barely faster than basic movement, it's also so much more boring. Hell, just looking at how long it takes to travel about 100 meters, I'm pretty sure this thing is slower than Usain Bolt. A human being is faster than a freaking high-powered motorcycle made with the express purpose of speeding through the streets of Gotham to stop crime across every corner. It's really bad, and just makes me appreciate the Batmobile even more than I already did. On to a more positive note, one gameplay decision I really like is the new take on detective work. Forget the crime scenes that would literally solve themselves in the Arkham games, and bring in a little puzzle that you actually have to take care in understanding and solving. You have to look for clues in the scene and put together the evidence to understand what's going on. You have to read the various notes and put together clues of your own volition to solve the crime. It's a lot of fun and an interesting way to take detective work. And speaking of puzzles, they're pretty well thought out and fun across the whole game. They don't tend to lead the Court of Owls storyline very often, but they're overall pretty fun. Another part that I'm mixed on though is stealth gameplay. It's obviously nowhere near as good as Arkham Stealth, but at the same time is more fleshed out than a lot of other stealth systems in games. It makes up a decent portion of gameplay, but at the same time, you're never actually forced into it. You can, and in many cases probably will be, seen by enemies at any point and just start regular combat with them. It'll be very hard combat since all the enemies have guns, but unlike most of the other games where guns are instant death, here you can just straight dodge bullets whenever you want, so they're a common part of regular combat. Stealth isn't exactly difficult as much as it is inconvenient, because you don't really have any options beyond the 2 takedown types and some explosive barrels. Meanwhile, enemies don't have much they can use against you aside from some guns and the occasional camera, which you can either hack with Batgirl or just disable entirely by finding the control panel. It's definitely not bad stealth, but it's definitely lacking, all things considered. And bosses are another mixed bag, but not for the reasons you might think. All the bosses in this game are honestly pretty good, though I won't be showing any of them for the sake of spoilers. They really test your reactions more than anything, as they're more focused on dodging than actually dealing out damage. And that's where the problem comes in. These fights are either way too long or way too short, and it all comes down to your level and which character you picked. If you picked Red Hood or Batgirl, congratulations, you have an absolute boss annihilator. They will shred through the opponent's health bar no matter how underleveled you are because of their busted momentum attacks. Meanwhile, if you chose Nightwing or Robin, enjoy one of the slowest boss beatdowns in history. I just so happened to pick Nightwing for the Mr. Freeze fight, and boy, let me tell you. That fight was fun and cool, pun intended, but by God was it slow. It took nearly 10 minutes just to get him down, and this was when I was exceeding the level cap the game expected me to be at. Meanwhile, I had Red Hood and Batgirl for Harley and the final boss, again no spoilers, and they absolutely shredded them down in seconds, despite being relatively underleveled for these sections. I didn't end up fighting anyone with Robin, but I imagine he'd be in a similar scenario to Nightwing, since he's a pretty low damage character compared to the rest of the crew. I definitely think they needed to do some damage scaling for these bosses, because they're all pretty good. It's just that some of them last way too long because they take almost no damage, while others didn't last long enough because they take stupid damage. I'm definitely happy with what we got, but it could have used a little bit of tweaking to make just a little bit better. And to finish things off, one aspect I unfortunately can't speak to is the multiplayer. It's one thing that in order to play they would also need a PS5 and a copy of this game, but it's another that I just have no friends. Let alone friends who would spend 10 straight hours grinding out this game with me to not even finish it. I can imagine co-op would have been a fun addition, and overall added to my experience, but I sadly can't speak to it. I bet it would have been fun to coordinate your attacks across Gotham to stop as many crimes as possible in a short amount of time, then reconvene to stop an especially difficult crime before heading back to the Belfry. But I just couldn't experience it. Sorry. Speaking of co-op though, one thing I'm really curious about is the future of this game. Regardless of the popularity, you know people are going to be speedrunning this game. And with how the overall game plays out, I'm really curious what a full speedrun will look like. There are already multiple New Game Plus runs as of writing this script, so I can only imagine what a fresh run might look like, especially if it were in co-op. I really hope this game gets picked up by the speedrunning community quickly, because I can honestly imagine this being really fun to try mapping out. I play Gotham Knights constantly fluctuating my character, and thankfully, the game actually made it possible to do this, since all your characters level up at once. This allows you to pick and choose who you want for each mission without having to grind them up on random crimes, or stick with one and not get them overleveled because you're being exclusive. I would end up going in a circle, giving everyone their time to shine in the spotlight, and I overall enjoyed my time with each of them. But because I know you all are gonna ask, here's a quick ranking of the characters from least good to best. Not saying worst because they all have their merits in one way or another. Number 4 is Nightwing. By far the least interesting member of the family to me because he doesn't really have a niche compared to the others. He's really middle of the road in just about everything, making him by far the least interesting to play as. Although he does get the best method of transportation in his glider, so he does have that going for him. Number 3 is Batgirl, a great combatant against single targets and an expert hacker. Batgirl, in my opinion, is a great starter character since she relies on single target damage, teaching you the importance of combos at an early stage. And even in that regard, she's a much better all-rounder than Nightwing, especially since she can actually make use of her ranged attacks in the middle of combos, something Dick definitely can't. She was also the character I both started and ended my run on, and I think I made a solid pick. Number 2 is Robin, an expert in stealth and has a great get-off-me nature, excellent for crowd control in later missions. Meanwhile, also having a much higher elemental exposure, being able to spread status conditions among enemies like the plague. So despite being relatively low damage, his speed and ability to dish out damage over time makes him a great character through and through. And number 1 is easily Red Hood. Jason feels by far the most fleshed out compared to the rest of the family, with heavy emphasis on all of his attack types rather than having one fall to the wayside and be nearly unusable. It's a unique take where you can get in close and be a heavy bruiser, or stay at range and pick people off with gun-fu chick damage. Both are much more interesting than the rest of the character's movesets, so I always looked forward to playing as Jason. On top of that is the aforementioned use he gets out of the grabbing mechanics, and on top of that, he has by far the best story of the group, having the rest of the family come to terms with the fact that he's here now and is a part of them. All that said, I really like all the characters. They're all distinct in their playstyle, and I'm overall glad I played the game like I did. If I were to do another run with just a single character though, I'd definitely pick Red Hood in a heartbeat. Honestly, half the time, Gotham Knights really feels like the developers originally wanted to just make a Red Hood game, but had to shoehorn everyone else in because just Jason wouldn't be enough to sell the concept for the shareholders. He has by far the most fun and interesting moveset, he has the most unique upgrades that let him fill out said moveset, he has by far the best story of the group, and pretty much has the best actor out of all the Knights. In hindsight, they really should have just given us a Red Hood game. I think that would have been far better in just about every respect, and could have focused the relatively disjointed story a lot more. Sorry, I'm getting sidetracked, moving on. There's a lot of complaints that this game got that I feel I need to address before finishing this review. First is the whole last gen removal controversy. And yeah, this was a really bad move on WB's part. Not only did they restrict this game to an incredibly exclusive club of people, they did so after previously saying that they wouldn't be doing it. Next-gen consoles are not only stupid expensive, they're also incredibly hard to come by. For every million PS4s in existence, you might be lucky to find 3 PS5s. And that's after the console has already been out for 2 freaking years! But in the end, that's not why everyone's mad. People are mad because WB broke their promise. And I can more than understand that. But I also understand WB's perspective. They were making an incredibly graphically intensive game. This thing would not even be able to run on an Xbox One, let alone run optimally. So it just makes sense that to provide an optimal gameplay experience, they excluded it to platforms that could actually handle it. Now you could, and frankly should, argue that they should have made a version for last gen that was less graphically intensive, like many companies have done to get their games on the Switch, like Doom Eternal and Crash 4. They made a slightly different version of the game that could handle the lower end hardware, not only granting the game to a larger audience, but allowing it to actually be played optimally, even if the graphical experience isn't going to be the same. Personally, I believe this was a higher-ups decision rather than WB Montreal's. They saw $ being allowed to sell their game at a slightly higher price and assumed people would be more than willing to shell out tons of money for next-gen hardware if it meant they got to play this supposedly incredible game. But that didn't end up happening, so they probably regret this decision now. I was honestly indifferent to this decision at the time, because I was going to go next-gen soon enough anyway for Suicide Squad. I didn't even know Gotham Knights was planned for last gen until I heard about this controversy, so this was never an issue to me. But I more than understand everyone's anger at this, so, go off all you want. Second are apparent frame rate issues I've heard a lot of people mentioning. And I've just gotta say, y'all must be playing on some really low-end PCs for that to be the case. Because the only time I got even a single frame drop was just after a loading screen. This game ran smooth as butter throughout my entire experience, and I literally only had a single noticeable graphical glitch on top of that. That being Jason's hoodie straps being uncomfortably erect during basically all gameplay. Considering that was the worst of my performance experiences, this is a completely moot complaint. So, yeah. To put it another way, Gotham Knights is truly one of the games of all time. And honestly, I think that's where people's problems have been stemming from. After being absolutely spoiled to hell and back by the Arkham franchise and Insomniac's Spider-Man, people are expecting the absolute cream of the crop when it comes to superhero games. So seeing something not only different, but also not absolutely excellent would just be a massive disappointment. Would I call Gotham Knights a disappointment? No. I wasn't expecting it to be the next Arkham, because we knew right from the first gameplay showcase that it wasn't going to be. It's a different take on a modern superhero game, and it's just that. Different. It's not absolutely excellent, but it's nowhere near as terrible as some of y'all have been bashing it. Gaming as a whole seems to be on a binary nowadays. Something either has to be absolute perfection that never goes on sale because of how outstanding it is, or is reduced to the dollar bin at your local Walmart after being on shelves for only 3 months. You never hear people talking about just good games. Everything has to be a 10 out of 10 or a 0 out of 10. Why can't we just get more in the middle? Because that's exactly where I'd place Gotham Knights. So should you play it? Yeah, probably. If you just want to turn off your brain and play something for the fun of it, I don't see why you shouldn't. I'll probably end up going back to it at some point in the future, be it for a challenge or just to play through it again. But if you're expecting a gameplay and narrative masterpiece on the same level as Arkham or Spider-Man, you're better off just waiting for Spider-Man 2 or Suicide Squad. I don't know, but do with this review as you will. I've said my piece. This game is good. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later, chaps.
Weakling.
What the? Maybe you vigilantes aren't all bad.
Just taking care of the real bad guys.
Oh, no!